The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call Reverend Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this bill cancels the 2016 triennial general election for the Southern DHB. It is not a bill we should be passing lightly. Democracy was suspended at the DHB 6 months ago, and so far as outputs go, we've not seen a lot from the commissioners. We've got a one-page strategic planning document that looks more like a Christmas card than a plan. And that is it. The partnership group, which was supposed to be appointed a long time ago, has only finally received its last member in recent weeks. And they have been asked by this minister to produce very little, and they seem to be obliging. This government has been slow to act in the Southern DHB. Given years of deficits and months of adverse publicity, months and months that's turned into years, perhaps the most surprising thing about the appointment of the commissioners was the fact that it took the minister so long to act. And I guess that is the problem. This government has been struggling with this DHB amongst many for such a long time. It has tried to maintain the facade of an arm's length arrangement. The minister always chooses the board chair and 5 out of 12 board members. He has effective control of the board. He's had a Crown monitor on there, or his predecessor has, for nearly 6 years before this commissioner group was appointed, and still the minister and his predecessor made no progress. The minister is now tied to the outcomes. I made this point in an earlier contribution to the House. Any remaining impression of ministerial distance from decision-making was sacrificed with the appointment of the commissioner. And I imagine the minister now has a few sleepless nights because he now has a commissioner team in place, and New Zealand, and particularly those in the south, are expecting results. Mr. Coleman has nowhere to hide. He can no longer blame the board. Fixing the Southern DHB won't be easy. The cultural challenges indeed are well canvassed, and some departments have some work to do to work out how to work together, since the boundary between the southernmost DHB and the Otago DHB was removed, along with $30 million of cross-border funding. And of course, funding matters. Funding matters. The inquiry that Jonathan Coleman launched into the National Health Funding Model is entirely narrow. It seems designed to fit public demand for some kind of inquiry without delivering a result. And there is certainly a prima facie case to reform the funding model. It seems to have an adverse effect on some DHBs, and particularly the south. We know that the health workforce training appears to be more expensive than the compensation given to the Southern DHB. It takes a long time to treat patients whilst training students at the same time. We know that having the largest geographic area in the south, DHB the size of Belgium, isn't matched with the largest rural funding component. That needs some explaining. And we know that old buildings, and this one is over 50 years old, force less efficient, older ways of operating. It is there for the explaining, and the government does need to front up and have a full review of the health funding formula. It's 10 years since the last review, and Labor was in power then. It's time the health funding formula was reviewed and made more transparent. The glacial progress under the Commissioner team toward a hospital rebuild should bother us all. Delays are a big deal. The hospital has lost accreditation across a number of areas. It's lost Medical Council training accreditation for house officers. It's lost orthopaedics accreditation. It has lost intensive care accreditation for training, and the latter being directly attributed to old buildings. This loss of status has a knock-on effect. It harms the medical school, it harms the university, it harms the city of Dunedin and the district right across Otago and Southern. It also means that we cannot attract the calibre of staff that we would want to. There is so much uncertainty in the DHB. Specialists around the world are going to think twice before they move to the south. This government needs to give some certainty of direction. It needs to give assurances. It needs to put capital up front and outline a credible plan for an appropriate rebuild. And the Becker Consulting report last year confirmed that the clinical services building is outdated, that the ward and clinical layouts are beyond the use-by date. The modern clinical services buildings that are being built across Australasia have a wider footprint. They have more ceiling space to allow for ducting and modern surgical equipment to be housed in them. It just means that everything happens a little slower in the old buildings, and that carries a cost, which adds to all the other costs that the Southern DHB is carrying and the depletion in the funding that it appears to have. These problems are not going to go away overnight, but the government needs to act credibly. It needs to lay out a plan. It needs to stop dilly-dallying and duck shoving. We need the urgency. The signalled appointment of the partnership group was delayed time and again. The partnership group appointment, the last of which has just occurred, is now in place, but the deliverables are minimal. The Minister, Tony Ryle, indicated he expected a business case this year to Cabinet for a hospital rebuild. The current Minister, Jonathan Coleman, indicated in February he expected it by the end of this year. And now the latest timetable has merely a scoping report by the partnership group delivered at the end of next year. The timeframes continue to slip, and there is no indication that once the strategic business case is completed, there is no indication of a timeframe for that to go to Cabinet, for decisions to be made, for people in the South to have assurances about their health system. The Minister simply must step up. It is not good enough that previous assurances a business case would be considered this year have been pushed out onto the never-never. The only thing we have certainty of now is that it is not going to happen this year. We've got an amorphous promise of a rebuild completed in around 10 years' time. Without a concrete start date and committed capital, assurances from the Minister, these promises and assurances he is giving amount to little more than duck shoving, making the rebuild the problem of some future government. The real test of commitment from this government is a guarantee that before this term of government ends in late 2017, that there will be bricks and mortar being built, that there will be a rebuild underway during the term of this government. And I very much look forward to the speakers that follow me confirming that. Because certainly those who are in the South, and I expect some of them to speak, perhaps Mr Barclay opposite will speak, will assure us, perhaps they will assure us that this will happen, because the Minister has said they have been very supportive. Well, I've heard nothing but sycophancy from them. I want to hear the concrete steps that will be taken to deliver a hospital to people in the South. I think it is shameful that members down South are parroting the Minister's words and offering platitudes and obfuscation to their citizens that they represent. Excuse me. Those members need to step up. They need to encourage their own Minister to get focused, get on with the rebuild and give some assurances to the people of the South that they are being taken seriously, that their taxes matter and that the rebuild will get underway. Affordable access to decent healthcare should be something every Kiwi can count on. But something that we have become to expect of right is becoming harder and harder to access under this government. We have had a report done, an independent report, that shows $1.7 billion worth of underfunding under this government's watch. $1.7 billion of health underfunding. And that is why when Jonathan Coleman admits, and he has admitted to this House, that he is not funding health system to keep up with cost pressures, that is why New Zealanders are now seeing the level of healthcare declining. That is the reason why the Prime Minister is saying that Pharmac will not fund Keytruda. That is why they are dancing on the head of a pin when it comes to every health question. If you underfund a system by $1.7 billion, it is no wonder that health care is suffering, that New Zealanders are suffering in a way that they haven't before. This government is simply not committed to public health. And here we have a bill that suspends democracy and no assurance from this government that they will not do the same thing if they are re-elected for another term, that they will not suspend democracy further. We've seen them do it with ECAN. We have seen them do it with ECAN. They have pushed out democracy and pushed out democracy and pushed out democracy with no respect for the conventions, for no respect for the community representation that comes through with that. And now we have a similar situation here. We need assurances from the Minister
Sorry to interrupt the member, but his time has expired.